Black doctor saves life of racist woman. And she wakes up furious. Welcome, dear listeners. Tonight, we journey into a tale of healing, resilience, and unexpected connections. It's a story of two souls, one seeking recovery, the other offering quiet strength, who cross paths within the sterile walls of a hospital. Their lives will intertwine, revealing how courage and compassion can light even the darkest paths forward. The night was still, settled in the small city hospital like a calm before a storm. The gentle hum of machines, the occasional shuffle of footsteps, and the low murmur of medical conversations painted a picture of steady but quiet diligence. It was in this atmosphere that Dr. David Williams, a man both respected and admired for his calm demeanor and surgical precision, was alerted to a patient in critical condition. "Dr. Williams, there's a new emergency," said the nurse who approached him with an urgent but composed expression. A woman in her 50s, Karen Thompson. She was brought in after collapsing at her home. "She's in surgery now, but there have been complications." David glanced at the clock. Another long night lay ahead, but such was his life. He barely allowed himself a breath as he nodded to the nurse, already shifting his mind into surgical mode. This was what he had trained for, and in that training, he had learned the importance of tuning out distractions. He slipped on his surgical gloves with practiced ease, every movement a testament to the years he had spent perfecting his craft. The operating room was bright, cold, intense, a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital. Karen lay there, unconscious, the monitors beside her blipping softly, providing the only rhythm to the otherwise quiet room. David's focus narrowed. In his world, every second counted, and every decision could be the difference between life and death. There was no room for error. For hours, he worked with steady hands, his brow furrowing as he navigated the complications. The surgery, which should have been routine, had taken an unexpected turn, requiring every ounce of his attention and skill. There were moments when fatigue began to nibble at the edges of his focus. But David pushed it away. The thought of someone's life held in his hands fueled him to continue. When he finally removed his gloves and looked at the clock, hours had passed. He knew he had done all he could. Karen Thompson was stable. Her vitals were improving, and her body, although weakened, had survived the ordeal. Relief settled into his shoulders as he prepared to step out and inform the staff of her progress. There was no applause, no grand recognition, but he didn't expect it. David never looked for praise. For him, the fulfillment lay in the quiet victory of saving another life. Back in the hospital corridors, David took a moment to catch his breath, leaning against the wall. The quiet hallways felt almost tranquil after the relentless intensity of the operating room. He closed his eyes briefly, just enough to feel a moment of peace before his pager buzzed again. Karen had woken up. David felt a familiar pull, a sense of responsibility that came with knowing a patient was out of surgery, awake, and ready to begin the long road to recovery. He headed to the recovery room where Karen lay, adjusting his thoughts as he prepared to meet her. Stepping inside, he noticed Karen's expression, a blend of exhaustion, confusion, and discomfort. As often happened with patients coming out of surgery, her eyes opened slowly, and she gazed around with a bleary gaze that gradually sharpened as she focused on him. Her face twisted in pain as she lifted a hand toward her bandaged side. "Good evening, Ms. Thompson," David said gently. "I'm Dr. Williams. I performed your surgery. You went through a tough ordeal, but you're stable now and on the path to recovery." Karen didn't answer immediately, her eyes scanning his face. She looked at him with a stern expression, her brows knitting together as she attempted to sit up, wincing at the sharp pull of her stitches. Finally, she spoke, her voice tight and sharp. You were my surgeon?" David's heart dropped a little, not out of hurt, but out of something deeper, a knowing weariness. He was all too familiar with the doubts and the skepticism. He forced a calm, reassuring smile, his voice soft and steady as he continued. "Yes, Ms. Thompson, I was responsible for the operation, and I'm here to support your recovery." He gestured gently to her bandages. "Your surgery was successful, though your body will need time to heal. I'll be checking in regularly to ensure everything's going as expected." Karen's eyes narrowed. "I feel worse than before. What did you do to me?" Her words were pointed, tinged with accusation. But David didn't flinch. His training had instilled in him the art of composure and patience. He gently took her chart, confirming that her vitals were steady and that the surgery had been indeed successful, her body responding well to the procedure. "Your pain is a natural part of the healing process. I can assure you that you're doing well. I'll also make adjustments to your medication to help ease the discomfort." Karen's lips twisted, her face flushing slightly. She pointed at the bandages again, clearly not content. "I don't believe you. I've never felt like this before, and I don't want you handling my care. I'll be asking for a second opinion." David remained silent for a moment, allowing her words to settle in the air. Her response wasn't uncommon. Some patients woke up feeling disoriented, resentful, even frustrated. The shock and pain were often directed at whoever they saw first. And in this case, that person happened to be him. "Of course," he replied with quiet resolve. "If you'd like, I'll arrange for a consultation with the hospital director. You're in good hands here, Ms. Thompson, and I'll ensure you have the best care possible." He watched her closely, noting the way her face softened ever so slightly, her breathing slowing as her exhaustion overtook her frustration. The initial sting of hostility might not have fully abated, but he sensed the exhaustion beneath her anger. In that moment, she didn't see him as her healer, but rather as an intruder on her suffering. And perhaps, in some distant way, David understood that pain. Later, as he returned to his rounds, David thought about Karen's reaction. In the back of his mind, he held a flicker of hope that with time, her attitude would soften. He couldn't control her feelings, but he could ensure that her care remained as professional and compassionate as possible. In his quiet moments alone, David often thought about the deeper meaning behind his role, the silent call he had answered when he had chosen this path. It wasn't merely about healing bodies. It was about reaching out in moments of vulnerability and providing a sense of trust, comfort, and dignity, even when it wasn't immediately welcomed. Karen's case, as challenging as it was already proving to be, would simply be another layer in his journey as a doctor. He was prepared to face whatever came, with the hope that perhaps, one day, she would see beyond her frustration and recognize the compassion he offered. But for now, he would keep doing his job, steadily and faithfully. As he always had, he would stand by her side, quietly guiding her through each step of her recovery, hoping that she would come to realize the intentions behind his care. The next morning, as dawn crept through the hospital's windows, David rose from the small break room chair where he'd managed a short, restless sleep. He shook off the fatigue and prepared for his rounds. The previous night's surgery had been just one part of the demands waiting for him that day. But Karen Thompson remained on his mind, her initial hostility still fresh in his memory. As he made his way through the sterile halls, exchanging quiet nods with colleagues and murmuring words of encouragement to his patients, David felt a sense of resolve settle in. For him, each patient was not just a case or a number. They were people who, whether knowingly or not, trusted him with their lives. To be met with anger and distrust was not a new experience, but it was one he hoped to overcome in each interaction. He found himself in front of Karen's room once again, her door slightly ajar. She was lying back against the pillows, her face pale, though the lines of discomfort seemed to have softened. She had spent the night healing, albeit reluctantly, and her gaze lingered on the ceiling. Lost in thought. "Good morning, Ms. Thompson," David said, gently knocking on the door frame before stepping inside. "How are you feeling today?" Her gaze slid toward him, and the faint glint of resistance in her eyes reminded him of their previous exchange. Still, she said nothing, merely crossing her arms over her chest and staring at him in silence. He took this as an opportunity to proceed with his usual checkup. Unfazed by her continued scrutiny, moving quietly, he reviewed her vitals, his movements calm and deliberate, As he checked her bandages, he spoke with a gentle, encouraging tone. Your incision is healing well. The soreness you feel is natural, but I can adjust your pain relief if needed. For a moment, Karen said nothing. Then, without warning, she asked, "Why are you here? Surely there's someone else on duty who could do this." David paused, surprised by the question. He searched her expression, noting the subtle mix of pride and reluctance beneath her exterior. He understood that for some patients, vulnerability was uncomfortable. Karen, it seemed, was no exception. "This is my responsibility, Ms. Thompson," he replied patiently, "and I make it a point to follow up with each of my patients personally. I believe it's important to provide consistency in care, especially after a difficult surgery." Her lips thinned into a line, and she shifted slightly, wincing as the movement tugged at her stitches. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden," he replied gently. "Everyone deserves the best care possible. It's my job to provide that, and it's one I'm committed to." For the first time, he saw a flicker of emotion, a brief softening in her gaze. It was gone as quickly as it came, but he felt a small glimmer of progress. As David prepared to leave her room, Karen's voice stopped him. "Do you enjoy this?" she asked, her tone carrying a note of skepticism. He turned back, genuinely considering her question. "Yes, I do. I love helping people, giving them a chance to live healthier lives. It's challenging, yes, but it's deeply fulfilling. And sometimes," he added, a touch of warmth in his tone, "seeing a patient recover against the odds is the best reward." Karen blinked, perhaps taken aback by his earnestness. Her face softened, though she quickly masked it with a neutral expression. She didn't reply, but she held his gaze a moment longer than before, and David took this as a small victory. As the day continued, David found himself drawn back to thoughts of his own journey into medicine. Like so many others, he had chosen this path not only out of intellectual curiosity, but out of a deep desire to help others, to be a part of something bigger than himself. It was a dream born from long hours of study, late nights, and the steady support of his family, who had always believed in his potential. Later that afternoon, he found himself once again making rounds, attending to patients with a gentle hand and listening ear. It wasn't until he passed the nurse's station that he overheard two staff members discussing Karen Thompson. "She's been pressing the call button constantly," one nurse murmured with a sigh. "Every little thing. She needs immediate attention." "I know," replied the other with a sympathetic shrug. "But you have to understand, she's probably frightened, feeling vulnerable. People act out when they're afraid." David felt a pang of sympathy as he realized just how deeply Karen's fear ran. Beneath her words, her sharp tone, and her unwillingness to trust, there was a person who felt lost, helpless, and frustrated. He was no stranger to these feelings. Every patient wrestled with them to some degree. Yet, Karen's situation seemed to touch him in a particular way, as if a part of him understood her reluctance to accept vulnerability. That evening, he returned to Karen's room once more, hoping to make a small connection, to assure her that she wasn't alone in her journey to recovery. As he entered, he noticed her gaze shift to him, her expression guarded but less hostile. "Ms. Thompson, I wanted to check in one last time before the night shift takes over. How's your pain level?" She hesitated, her gaze flicking down as she seemed to wrestle with an answer. "It's better," she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She seemed almost surprised by her own admission, as though allowing herself to acknowledge even a small improvement was a step she hadn't anticipated. David nodded, smiling softly. "That's good to hear. It means you're healing, and that's a positive sign." They stood in a moment of quiet, the sounds of the hospital muffled around them. David sensed a subtle shift, an unspoken understanding that perhaps she was beginning to see him as more than just a presence she resented. As he prepared to leave, Karen cleared her throat, her voice catching him just before he reached the door. "Doctor," she began, her tone hesitant. "What made you decide to do this? To become, well, a doctor?" David turned, a bit surprised by the question. He paused, reflecting for a moment before answering. I chose this path because I've always believed that healing others is one of the most meaningful things we can do. There's something very fulfilling about guiding people through their toughest moments, helping them get back to their lives, their families, their dreams. Karen seemed to absorb his words, her gaze distant, as though she was lost in thoughts of her own life and the dreams she had once held. David noticed her expression soften, a subtle trace of melancholy passing over her features. "Thank you," she said quietly, almost reluctantly. The words were barely audible, but David heard them all the same, and they resonated deeply within him. It was a small shift, but he knew it marked the beginning of something, a tiny step toward trust. Perhaps, as he left her room that night, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would likely be more moments of resistance, of skepticism and frustration. But if Karen was beginning to let down her guard, even just a little, then perhaps there was hope for a genuine connection to form. And for David, that connection was as vital to healing as the physical care he provided. It was a reminder of why he had chosen this path, to reach people's hearts as much as their bodies, to remind them that they were not alone. The next few days unfolded with the steady rhythm of hospital life. Dr. David Williams went about his duties with his usual calm efficiency, balancing a schedule full of patients who each demanded a unique mix of compassion and care. And yet, in the quiet spaces between his rounds, his mind often drifted back to Karen Thompson. Karen had become somewhat of a paradox for him. She was difficult, often harsh, but underneath her anger, David sensed a vulnerability. He knew that most hostility came from fear, of fear dependence, of change, and of the unknown. In Karen's case, he felt that her anger masked something much deeper. Though what that was, he could only guess. One afternoon, while David was discussing patient updates with the nursing team, he noticed a shift in the atmosphere around Karen's room. One of the nurses, Janet, approached him, an expression of mild exasperation on her face. "Dr. Williams, Ms. Thompson has been calling for you specifically. She insists she needs to speak with you about her care," Janet said with a small sigh. David nodded, a hint of curiosity flickering in his eyes. "Thank you, Janet. I'll check in with her." As he walked to Karen's room, he mentally prepared himself for whatever frustrations she might unleash. But when he entered, he found her sitting up, her expression tense yet hesitant, as though caught between anger and something softer, something unspoken. Karen looked at him, her gaze sharp but weary. I wanted to ask you something," she began, her voice guarded. "Of course," David replied, his tone steady. "What's on your mind?" She shifted uncomfortably, as though struggling to find the right words. "This recovery process, you keep saying I'm healing, that things are going well. But I don't feel that way. I feel broken." David's heart softened at her admission. He approached her bedside, pulling up a chair to sit beside her. "I understand," he said gently. "Healing is never as simple or straightforward as we'd like. It's different for everyone, and it can bring up feelings you don't expect." Karen looked down, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. "I guess I never thought it would be like this," she murmured, almost to herself. "Being vulnerable, needing help, it's not something I'm used to." There was an opening into the softer side of her, a glimpse into her reluctance. David nodded, waiting a moment before he spoke. "I've seen many patients go through this. Karen, being in a hospital can make you feel powerless, as if all control is out of reach. But healing is more than physical recovery. It's also about finding ways to accept help, to let others be there for you." She looked at him, her expression still guarded but softer than before. "You make it sound so easy, but I've spent my whole life learning to be strong, to stand on my own." David leaned forward, his gaze warm and understanding. "I respect that strength, truly, and it's what's helped you make it this far. But strength isn't just about independence. Sometimes, it's about allowing yourself to rely on others. Letting people care for you can be its own kind of courage." Karen's eyes flickered with a mix of emotions, a subtle shift in her demeanor that told him she was absorbing his words, perhaps even considering them. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but instead, she turned her gaze toward the window, looking out at the world beyond with a contemplative expression. After a pause, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. I used to dream about all the things I'd do once I retired. I thought I'd finally be able to travel, see places I've only read about. But now, she trailed off, shaking her head slightly. Now I wonder if I'll even get there. This feels like a setback I hadn't planned for. David nodded, understanding the weight of her words. Dreams often had a way of slipping into the background when health became uncertain. Setbacks don't define you. Karen, he said softly, this may be a difficult chapter, but it doesn't erase the possibilities ahead. And recovery is not about returning to what you were before. It's about growing into what you're meant to become after. A faint, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of her lips, though she quickly looked away, her face settling back into its usual guarded expression. You sound like one of those motivational posters, she said dryly, though there was a hint of warmth in her tone. David chuckled. Maybe I've read one too many, he admitted, but I believe in what I said. You have more strength than you realize. And sometimes, that strength is what sees us through the darkest times. Karen didn't respond, but her silence held a different quality now, one that seemed to carry the weight of unspoken thoughts and memories. David sensed that she wasn't used to sharing her fears, her dreams, or her regrets with anyone. He respected that. Healing was a private journey, after all, and he knew the value of patience. As he rose to leave, Karen's voice stopped him once more. Doctor, she began, her tone softer than he'd ever heard it. I didn't mean to. Thank you for being here, for listening. David looked at her, a warm smile touching his face. You're welcome, Karen. It's what I'm here for. And remember, this is a journey for both of us. I'll be here every step of the way. Leaving her room, David felt a small sense of victory, not one he could quantify or explain, but one he sensed in the gradual softening of her defenses. For a doctor, there were few moments as satisfying as seeing a patient begin to believe in their own ability to heal. That evening, as David sat alone in the staff lounge, sipping a lukewarm cup of coffee, he found himself reflecting on his own journey. There was a time when he had doubted himself, doubted his capacity to care for others in the ways he had always envisioned. The rigorous demands of his training had at times threatened to wear him down. And yet, the dream of helping others had never faded. Karen's journey reminded him of those early days, of the moments when self-doubt had seemed like an insurmountable wall. In her fears, he saw a reflection of his own vulnerabilities, his own questions about his path. It was a humbling reminder of why he had chosen this profession, to be a bridge for those who felt lost, to walk with them as they found their way. When he returned to the ward later that night, he passed by Karen's room. The lights were dim, and she was already asleep, her face relaxed in a way he had rarely seen. David paused outside her door, a quiet sense of peace settling over him. In her room, a single beam of moonlight cast a gentle glow, illuminating the lines of her face, softened now by the dreams that carried her through the night. For the first time since her arrival, David felt that she was beginning to accept her journey, beginning to find a fragile sense of trust in the process. In the stillness of that moment, David felt the weight of both her burdens and his own. He knew that healing was never linear, never easy, but in that quiet, moonlit moment, he felt a small but powerful reassurance. He would be there, just as he had always promised, ready to guide her through whatever lay ahead. As the days passed, Karen Thompson's recovery continued steadily, though each day brought its own small challenges. She remained wary and sometimes difficult, her patience wearing thin at times. But David Williams could see a shift in her demeanor, a gradual softening. It was as if, slowly, she was beginning to let go of her initial resentment and to embrace, however reluctantly, the support around her. One late morning, as David made his rounds, he found Karen sitting upright in bed, her gaze focused on the book in her lap. She looked up as he entered, marking her page, but saying nothing. "Good morning, Karen," he greeted her with his usual calm. "How are you feeling today?" She shrugged, glancing down at her hands, which rested quietly on the book. The pain's there, but it's not as bad as before, she admitted. Almost reluctantly, there was a vulnerability in her eyes, a crack in the guarded exterior she had shown him since the beginning. That's good to hear, he said with a smile, moving to check her vitals. You're making steady progress, and that's a sign that you're healing well. Karen looked out the window, avoiding his gaze. After a moment of silence, she spoke, her voice softer than usual. I'm not sure I believe in progress anymore. Dr. Williams, I feel like life stopped the moment I ended up here. And now everything I planned just seems so far away. David paused, sensing the depth of her words. He knew that patients often felt a sense of isolation during recovery, as if the life they had known before was somehow slipping away. He leaned in slightly, his gaze gentle. I know it feels that way now, Karen, but recovery is about regaining more than just health. It's also about rediscovering hope, finding strength to face the life you want to live. She shook her head, a small, bitter laugh escaping her lips. I used to think I was strong, independent, but now it's like I don't even know who I am anymore. David's heart went out to her, seeing the weight of her own self-doubt pressing down. He was familiar with this struggle, the feeling of standing at a crossroads, uncertain of who you are or where you're going. He thought back to his own journey, the years of hard work, the sacrifices, and the times he had questioned if he was truly making a difference. Karen, he began gently, strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up, even when it feels impossible. And sometimes, we find our true strength in the moments when we feel weakest. She looked at him, a mixture of surprise and relief flickering in her eyes. Do you really believe that? David nodded without hesitation. I do. In fact, some of the strongest people I've known are those who have faced the hardest battles and found a way to keep going. Karen was silent, her gaze fixed on him as if she were searching for something, perhaps reassurance, or maybe a spark of belief in herself. After a long pause, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a time before all this, when I thought I could do anything. I dreamed of visiting places I'd only seen in books, of seeing the world beyond my little corner of it. David smiled, sensing a glimpse of her old self coming through, the part of her that was still driven by dreams and possibilities. That part of you is still there. Karen, it may feel distant now, but it hasn't disappeared. This experience may feel like it's taken something away from you, but it can also give you something, a new perspective, a reminder of what truly matters. She looked down at her hands, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. You have a way of making it sound like I could still get there, like it's not too late. David's voice was warm, filled with quiet conviction. It's never too late. Every day is a new chance to grow, to move closer to the life you want. And sometimes, the path we didn't expect can lead us to something even more meaningful. Karen's gaze softened, her eyes glistening with a trace of emotion she couldn't quite mask. In that moment, he saw the wall she had so carefully constructed beginning to crumble. Her defenses, built out of fear and frustration, were giving way to something else, an openness, a willingness to let herself hope again. As he finished his examination, David noticed that her breathing was steadier, her posture more relaxed. It was as if the weight she had been carrying was beginning to lift, even if only slightly. Thank you, Dr. Williams, she said quietly, the words seeming to carry a weight of their own. I didn't realize how much I needed someone to tell me that things might still turn out all right. David nodded, offering her a gentle smile. I'm here for that. Karen, healing is more than just physical. It's about finding that light inside yourself again. And I see that light in you, even if you don't quite see it yet. After their conversation, David continued with his rounds, but the interaction with Karen stayed with him. He couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment in knowing that he was making a difference, not just in her recovery, but in her outlook on life. It was moments like these that reminded him of the deeper meaning behind his work, of the quiet victories that often went unnoticed. That evening, David found himself reflecting on his own journey, the countless patients he had treated, and the lives he had touched. He knew that his role was more than just a healer of bodies. It was about helping people rediscover hope, guiding them through their struggles, and reminding them of their own resilience. The next morning, David returned to Karen's room to find her looking out the window, a thoughtful expression on her face. She turned as he entered, her gaze meeting his with an openness he hadn't seen before. "I thought about what you said," she told him, her voice steady, "about finding strength even in the darkest times. I guess I never realized how much I needed to hear that." David nodded, a sense of warmth spreading through him. We all need reminders sometimes. Life can be challenging, and it's easy to lose sight of the things that give us purpose. But there's always a way forward, even if it's hard to see. Consight, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "You make it sound so simple." "It's never simple," he replied, his tone serious. "But it's worth it, and you're not alone in this journey. There are people who care, who want to see you thrive. Lean on them, on us when you need to. That's what we're here for." A look of gratitude crossed her face, and for the first time, Karen seemed at peace. She had come a long way from the guarded, resentful woman he had first met, and though her journey was far from over, she was beginning to embrace the possibility of healing, both inside and out. As David left her room, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He knew that Karen's path would still have its struggles, but she had taken a crucial step forward. She was starting to believe, not just in the medical care she was receiving, but in her own strength and potential. The hospital's hum of activity continued around him, the steady rhythm of a place where healing happened every day. But for David, there was a unique fulfillment in helping Karen find her way through her darkest moments. It was a reminder that his work wasn't just about the body. It was about reaching the heart and soul, about helping people see the beauty in life, even when it seemed elusive. In the quiet halls of the hospital, as he continued his rounds, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had come to heal, yes, but in doing so, he was also a part of something larger, guiding others as they found the courage to rebuild their lives, one small victory at a time. Karen Thompson's recovery progressed steadily in the weeks that followed. Though her physical wounds were healing, David knew that her emotional journey was just beginning. He had seen her face moments of clarity, where hope would flicker in her eyes like a candle. But he knew that lasting change often came in the quiet hours, when there was no one there to witness it, only the patient's own heart making peace with the experience. One morning, David arrived at the hospital to find Karen's discharge papers on his desk. He read them carefully, surprised by how soon the day had arrived. Karen had made an impressive recovery, and she was ready to leave, to return to her life. But he felt a small pang of sadness, knowing that this chapter in her life and in his work with her was coming to a close. After his rounds, he made his way to Karen's room, where she was sitting in a chair beside the window, dressed in her own clothes for the first time since her surgery. She looked out at the hospital grounds, her face calm and contemplative. As he entered, she turned to him, a soft smile touching her lips. "Good morning, Dr. Williams," she said, her voice gentle. "I hear I'm finally getting out of here." David smiled back, though he felt a trace of melancholy mixed with pride. "Yes, you are. You've come a long way. Karen, I'm glad to see you ready to head home." She nodded, her gaze drifting back to the view outside. "I feel different. I don't know if I'm the same person who came in here. I'm still not sure what that means, but I feel like I'm leaving a part of myself behind." David approached her, understanding the weight of her words. "That's natural. Sometimes, healing changes us in ways we don't expect. It isn't just about the body. It's about moving forward, even when the road looks different than we planned." Karen turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think I'll find that sense of purpose again? I came here feeling so lost, so uncertain. Now, I feel like I'm standing at a crossroads, and I don't know which path to take." David took a seat across from her, his gaze steady. "Karen, the fact that you're even asking that question is a sign of how far you've come. It's natural to feel uncertain, but you have the strength to face whatever comes next. You may not have all the answers, but life is a way of unfolding as we walk forward. One step at a time. She nodded, absorbing his words. Thank you, David, for everything. I don't think I could have gotten through this without you. There was a sincerity in her eyes that moved him. In the beginning, she had been guarded, even hostile. But now, she looked at him with gratitude, with a respect that hadn't been there before. It was a silent testament to her journey and to the bond they had forged through her recovery. David smiled, his heart warming at her words. It was my honor to be a part of your journey. Karen, you've taught me as much as I hope I've given you. I want you to remember that healing isn't a single destination. It's a journey, one you'll continue each day as you move forward. Karen smiled back, a hint of her old resilience shining through. I'll try to remember that, she replied softly. And I'll remember the things you've said. They've given me more courage than I thought I'd ever find in a place like this. They shared a quiet moment, both acknowledging the significance of this farewell. Then, after a pause, Karen reached out, her hand resting on his for a brief but powerful moment. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of 100 unspoken words. A silent thank you that needed no further elaboration. As David stood to leave, he looked back at her one last time. You're ready, Karen. You have everything you need to find your way forward. With that, he left her room, feeling a sense of peace mingled with a touch of bittersweetness. As he walked down the familiar hospital corridor, he felt the weight of his own journey as a doctor, the countless patients, each with their own struggles and triumphs, each a unique story that had become a part of his own. When Karen finally left the hospital, the staff who had tended to her, the nurses who had patiently answered her calls, all felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. For them, she had been more than just a patient. She had been a reminder of why they had chosen this path, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. A few days later, David received a letter in his office. He recognized Karen's handwriting on the envelope, a simple but elegant script that spoke of her former life, her dignity, and the inner strength he had come to know. He opened it, and as he read, he felt a smile forming. In the letter, Karen expressed her gratitude for the care she had received. But it was more than just a thank you. She spoke of her dreams, the places she hoped to visit, the quiet determination she had rediscovered to live her life with a renewed sense of purpose. She shared with him how, after all her doubts and fears, she had come to see her time in the hospital as a turning point, a place where she had not only healed physically, but had also rekindled her belief in herself. Your words stayed with me, she wrote. They were a light in the dark, a reminder that I wasn't alone. I'm starting a new chapter now, one where I embrace life, not as something to endure, but as something to cherish. Thank you for being there, for your patience and kindness. You gave me the courage to face the future with hope. David felt a warmth in his chest as he folded the letter and placed it carefully in his desk drawer. He knew that he would carry her words with him, just as she would carry his. In a way, they had each become a part of the other's story, bound by a shared experience that had transcended the walls of the hospital. As he moved through the rest of his day, he noticed a renewed sense of energy in his work. Karen's journey had reminded him of why he had chosen this life, why he had spent those long nights and early mornings caring for those who needed it most. It was about more than healing bodies. It was about healing spirits, about giving people the strength to believe in themselves, even when they felt at their lowest. He knew there would be more patients, more stories, each one unique, each one a journey of its own. But he would always remember Karen, the woman who had walked through the darkest days and emerged with a new sense of purpose. In the quiet moments, when the day had ended and the hospital grew still, David would sometimes return to that letter. It was a reminder that his work mattered, that the bonds he formed with his patients went beyond the physical, touching something deeper, something lasting. And so, with each new patient, each new story, David continued forward, carrying with him the lessons he had learned from Karen Thompson. He had been her healer, yes, but in a way, she had been his as well. They had each found a measure of peace, a glimpse of courage, and a reminder that life, in all its complexity, was a journey meant to be shared. As the sun set over the hospital, David took a moment to stand at the window, watching the world beyond with a quiet, unwavering resolve. The road ahead would not always be easy, but he knew now, more than ever, that he was exactly where he needed to be. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey. We hope Karen and Dr. Williams' story has offered a reminder of the strength found in connection, compassion, and the courage to embrace life's uncertainties. Stories like these remind us that healing isn't just about mending bodies, but about reigniting hope and resilience in one another. We're grateful to have shared this with you today. Please subscribe for more inspiring stories, and may you carry a bit of their courage forward in your own life.